This tote bag is made up of a simple pattern with rectangular pattern pieces. It has two straps and a nice lining on the inside. It also has a square bottom, so it'll stand up when you put things in it and it can hold a lot without crumbling. We're going to go ahead and make this tote bag now. First, you need to have two straps. You can make these straps approximately 20 inches long. Then you'll need two pieces for the sides of your bag. These are 16 inches by 13 inches, and you'll also need two pieces for the lining. Then you'll need pieces for the sides, one for each of the lining. These are 16 by 6, as well as 13 by 6-inch pieces for the bottom of the bag. Get all these pieces ready. Once you have them, this is how they'll be laid out. You'll have the sides and the fronts alternating, with the bottom that will be sewn on to the bottom. They'll roll in as the first step, and you'll sew them all together, then attach the bottom. When we're at our sewing machine, I've already attached one. Notice that I did not sew all the way from the bottom. You want to start your seam allowance back. So as I put it into the sewing machine, I'm putting my needle down and then I'm looking at the marks on the sewing machine and I'll sew forward, then backstitch, but stop right where I have my seam allowance. Then I'm going to continue sewing, looking at the marks on the sewing machine plate so I have a consistent seam allowance. Then on the far side, I'm going to sew all the way to the end of the fabric. This is going to be the top of the bag. When you get to the top, make sure you backstitch a bit. Trim your threads, and then I'll fold this over, add the next piece, make sure that right sides are going together. Line everything up and put it under your presser foot. Again, we want to make sure we start one seam allowance away from the bottom. Look at the marks on the machine, backstitch, and then continue down, keeping everything aligned. Hold the pieces of fabric together so nothing goes in to the feed dogs faster than anything else. When you get to the back or top of the bag, sew all the way to the end, and then backstitch. Trim your thread. Now we have all our pieces and we're rolling the bag together. This is making a loop. Line up the pieces, put it under your presser foot, and again, don't start at the edge, start one seam allowance back. Sew, then backstitch looking at the marks on the sewing machine, and then continue all the way down to the end. Line everything out and hold your fabric straight. Sew until you get to the end of the fabric. Again, this is the top of the bag. Backstitch at the top. Trim your thread. Now you can see that the top of the bag still has pieces that we can attach the bottom to. Now we're attaching the bottom. That's why we didn't sew all the way to the end, because you can't go around the 90-degree corner unless you leave a little bit of slack. Now the key is make sure you don't sew through any other parts of the bag. Line the corners up. And then the most important thing now is to actually go where your thread is. So wherever you stopped, even if it wasn't precisely where you wanted to, make sure your needle now goes exactly there. Line up all the pieces, sew and backstitch, and then line up the pieces going towards the other end. Make sure you don't sew through any of the pieces. Remember, the goal is to stop exactly where your thread is. That way you'll have nice square corners on your bag. Trim your thread. Continue working around all sides of the bag. Again, drop your needle right where the other thread stops. Sew a bit and then backstitch. Careful not to go past where you started. Then you'll sew all the way down. Keep everything straight. Don't sew through the other pieces. Move the fabric out of the way. And then you want to end right at that point. Don't sew past. Backstitch. And you're done with that side. Now you need to sew the side parts. Again, the important part is not the edge of the fabric, but that you are sewing exactly in between the previous stitching. This is what's going to give you nice square corners on the outside. Even if there's a little bit of fabric hanging off the edge, that's fine. You want to make sure the stitching is accurate at this point. Don't forget the back stitch. Trim your thread. Now we have two bags. So you do the same thing for the lining as you do for the outer part. And then we're going to sew all four sides of the base together. So we'll line them up and it'll look just like this. Before we do that though, we want to iron the tops of the lining and the outer bag and put the straps on. So when you're at your ironing board, fold the bag down as much as you want to have at the top. Press this with your iron. Go all the way around and make sure it's nice and even. Once you have it pressed, it'll look like this. You see, I have it pressed all the way around on the top. The important part here is that the lining has been pulled back farther than the outside of the bag. This is so it'll look right at the end. Mark the center of your bag. Once you have the center marked, then measure 3¼ inches to both sides. This is the space in between the strapping. Go ahead and make some marks at 3¼ I like to go ahead and draw an X so I know what side of the mark the webbing goes on. Do this on both sides. You can mark out what size X box you want for your webbing and you can draw it. This is not necessary and I'm doing it for this tutorial so you can see where the stitching will go. When we get to our sewing machine, the webbing will go on like this. You want to put it just a little bit inside the top. You'll stitch straight across the top. Then when you get to the corner, make sure you leave your needle down. Pivot, and then sew straight down to the corner. Leave your needle down. Then you'll pivot again and sew across. Make sure you don't sew through any other parts of the fabric. When you get to the corner, leave your needle down. Here, I'm reversing to make sure my needle goes down in the webbing. Then sew to the top corner and leave your needle down. Pivot again, and this time we're going to sew the first diagonal. Sew all the way down to the corner. Now you're going to sew once again across. This reinforces the stitching on the bottom. When you get to the far corner, leave your needle down. Then you'll stitch the second diagonal. At the top corner, once again, leave your needle down, pivot, and you'll stitch across the top again. This is enough to secure the thread, but I always like the back tack just to make sure. Now you have one webbing on. Repeat for the other three. It should look like this. This will be a very strong connection for your handle. Now I have all my handles on. It's time to sew the bottoms of the bags together, just like I showed you before. You can line up the long edges and then sew inside the seam allowances. It's important to line up the corners. You don't have to start all the way at the end because you want to give your bag a little bit of space to breathe. Then, stitch right along the seam allowance. Again, don't go all the way to the end and then backstitch. Trim your thread. And then you're going to repeat this for all sides. Remember to line up your corners. Stitch and back tack. All the way down, but stop before you get to the end. Do this for the short sides as well. Now I just have to sew the short sides of the bottom. Both are still open. Sew the short sides with the same technique. This is the last short side to sew. And then the bottoms will be fully attached together. Now you can see that the bottoms of the bags are attached. It's a good idea to check your work now to make sure you didn't stitch anything incorrectly. Now we need to sew the sides. It's important to line each one up because if you don't, then they'll end at the wrong spot at the top. Take your time and line up the bottom corners, but don't start stitching all the way at the bottom. Start a little bit away from the corner. Then line up your seam allowances and stitch each side together. It can be a little confusing as you go, but just take your time and each corner should be with the same seam. Here is the next one. It doesn't matter which you have on top, whether it's the lining or the outer part of the bag. Just make sure you're only stitching through the seam allowances and you'll be fine. This is holding the lining to the outer shell of the bag so it doesn't pull out. There's nothing more annoying than having a lining pull out of a bag when you're using it. Once you go all the way around, you'll have a weird looking bag like this. It's not very useful because it's inside out. What we need to do is pull the bag shell out. So reach in and grab the bottom of the bag and pull everything through. Then pull at the outside of the bag, shove from the inside of the bag until you have the nice rectangle on the bottom. Take your time and make sure everything is stitched right. This is what the inside of the bag will look like. And then the lining will go right over the handles just like this. And we'll sew it together. You can use your scissors to reach inside the bag and then gently make sure that all of your corners are nice and pointy and turned out. Then your bag should look like this on the bottom, nice and square. Now it's time to sew the lining to the bag. Line up your seams and then decide how much you'll have the top of the bag overlap the lining. Then just stitch very carefully. You want to make sure that the distance is the same so it looks nice all the way around. If you waver on your distance, then the actual distance of the circumference of the circle will change and you'll either have too much lining or too little lining to go around. So take your time and be accurate. When you get to webbing, you may have to go a bit slower depending on your sewing machine. Keep lining up the bag and going around. Sew nice and straight. Make sure that you're not stitching through anything else. It can be super annoying to think that your bag is done only to realize that you've sewn a handle to the outside of your bag. When you get to each seam, this is the time to check. Make sure that those seams are lining up. These pattern pieces are the same size, so they should line up. If they don't, now is the time to correct. Do not be tempted to keep sewing. You need to make sure that everything is lined up. It's a lot easier to pick out some stitches than to have to pick out the stitches all the way around the bag. Take your time and be accurate. I'm using yellow thread here so you can see it, but you could use matching thread on your bag. When you get around to the stitching that you created previously, stitch right on top of it. There's no need to backstitch. This will hold it together fine. Now the bag is completed. It has a nice lining on the inside, very tough and durable on the outside, has a square so it'll stand up. We can put all kinds of things in it, like our iron. Then we can carry our iron all around town and show people our iron and be very happy with our very nice bag. I hope your bag turns out nice and you carry lots of stuff with it. Enjoy.